Raven, the shadowy kingpin, and his ruthless lieutenant, Kane, ruled Liverpool's streets with fear and cunning. But when betrayal lurked in their own ranks, the city's darkest secrets began to unravel. Liverpool's docks had long been a symbol of the city's industrious spirit, a place where ships arrived from distant lands, carrying goods that fueled commerce and life along the Mersey. By day the waterfront thrummed with activity, cranes lifted containers, workers shouted instructions, and the smell of salt and fish filled the air. But when night fell, the vibrant hum of the day faded into an eerie silence, broken only by the occasional echo of footsteps on wet cobblestones, or the distant howl of a stray dog. It was in these quiet hours that the true character of the docks emerged, a hidden world far removed from the city's tourists and office workers. Beneath the glow of flickering streetlights, abandoned warehouses became meeting points for those who preferred the shadows. The faint outlines of figures could be seen moving behind broken windows, exchanging parcels and cash in whispered transactions. No one knew exactly what they were trading. Some spoke of stolen goods, others of drugs and weapons. But the fear they inspired was real. Locals avoided these areas after dark, knowing that curiosity could be fatal. Stories of sudden disappearances circulated quietly in pubs and homes, tales that were never confirmed but never denied either. A man entering the wrong alley might vanish without a trace, leaving nothing but a faint echo of movement and the lingering smell of smoke from hastily burned evidence. Even the police tread carefully. Investigators patrolled the streets, their presence a temporary deterrent, but the gangs had long learned to disappear when needed. Surveillance cameras were destroyed or bypassed, informants were few and fearful, and the city's legal system often moved too slowly to catch up with the agile criminals who controlled the shadows. Rumors whispered that some officers were compromised, turning a blind eye for fear, loyalty, or personal gain. This invisible network of control made the docks feel like a city within a city, a place where normal rules did not apply, and survival depended on knowing when to move and when to hide. The dock's dark reputation attracted a peculiar mix of people. On the one hand, there were hardened criminals, young men and women hardened by life on the streets, drawn to the thrill and profit of the night. On the other, there were those trying to escape their pasts, seeking refuge in anonymity while hiding secrets they could not reveal. Occasionally, tourists and late-night wanderers stumbled too close to the wrong warehouse or alley, quickly realizing the danger of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Their presence was fleeting, often leaving only the faintest trace of fear behind them, as though the darkness itself had warned them away. In this hidden world, power was measured not by wealth or education, but by influence and fear. A single whisper could ripple through the streets, and one careless act could have deadly consequences. Those who rose to control the docks did so by understanding this delicate balance, using strategy, intimidation, and cunning rather than brute force alone. The docks were a chessboard, and every figure moving through the night played a role, some visible, others invisible, all shaping the story of Liverpool's darkest streets. By the time dawn approached, the shadows retreated, leaving behind faint traces of the night's activity, a scattered bottle, the faint smell of smoke, footprints leading to nowhere. Daylight washed over the docks, and life resumed as if nothing had happened. But the memory of the night lingered in the minds of those who had witnessed it, a reminder that Liverpool's beauty and vibrancy existed, side by side with a world of hidden danger, waiting quietly for darkness to fall once more. Among the winding streets and narrow alleys of Liverpool, a figure emerged, who would soon change the balance of power in the city's underworld. Known only by the nickname Raven, he was an enigmatic presence, quiet, observant, and careful, yet capable of sudden, ruthless action. Raven began his rise far from the spotlight, starting with small crimes that seemed almost insignificant at first. Petty thefts, minor scams, and street-level drug deals allowed him to gain a foothold without attracting too much attention from law enforcement. But even in these early days, there was something about him that set him apart, a keen mind for strategy, a sharp understanding of human weakness, and a fearlessness that unnerved even seasoned criminals. Raven's early operations were deliberate and precise. Unlike many who relied on brute force alone, he built alliances quietly, forming relationships with local gangs and even corrupt officials who could protect his movements. Every action was calculated to expand his influence while minimizing risk. By the time he reached his early 20s, Raven had begun to dominate entire neighborhoods, controlling the flow of illegal goods and the loyalties of those around him. His reputation spread quickly. Stories of his intelligence and cruelty became whispered warnings in pubs, playgrounds, and council estates alike. People learned to respect him, and fear followed naturally behind. What set Raven apart was not just his ambition, but his adaptability. When rivals attempted to challenge him, he didn't respond with mindless violence. Instead, he observed, studied, and waited for the perfect moment. Many who underestimated him paid the price. Disappearances, arson, and sabotage ensured that anyone attempting to seize his territory found themselves outmatched. Each move was a lesson in patience and precision, and the city soon recognized that Raven was not just another gang leader, he was building an empire. At the same time, Raven understood the value of secrecy. Most of his operations were hidden in plain sight. Ordinary businesses, from shipping companies to small shops, acted as fronts, masking the flow of drugs, money, and information. Even those working closely with him often knew only fragments of the bigger picture. This web of control was meticulously maintained, leaving outsiders, including law enforcement, struggling to piece together the scope of his operation. Raven's intelligence and foresight allowed him to stay steps ahead, and for a long time he seemed untouchable. But Raven's rise was not without consequences. The streets he controlled grew more dangerous. As violence became a tool to maintain order and loyalty, communities felt the tension in subtle ways. Windows shuttered at night, neighbors wary of strangers, and whispers of retaliation for the smallest perceived offense. People who once believed the docks and estates were simply places to live realized they had become part of a complex ecosystem of fear and power, with Raven at its center. By the end of his ascent, Raven had transformed from a street-level operator into the undisputed kingpin of Liverpool's hidden underworld. He wielded power with both intelligence and terror, reshaping the city in his image. The streets, the alleys, and the docks all bore silent testimony to his rise, each shadow hinting at the unseen influence of a man who had learned to turn fear into currency, loyalty into weapons, and secrecy into an empire. The city would never forget him, nor would it ever fully understand the extent of his reach, as Raven's shadow loomed over Liverpool, unseen but always present. The drug didn't just affect individuals, it altered entire neighborhoods. Shops closed early, parks emptied, and the streets grew quieter, not from peace but from fear. Crime surged as addiction fueled desperation. Robberies, muggings, and burglaries became daily occurrences. Some tried to resist, seeking help from charities and local authorities, but the scale of the problem was overwhelming. Hospitals struggled to cope with overdoses, while police forces were stretched thin, often responding to the symptoms rather than the root cause. Raven's influence allowed him to remain above the chaos, watching the city bend under the weight of a problem he had engineered. But it wasn't just the drug itself that cemented Raven's control, it was the system he built around it. Dealers loyal to him patrolled the streets, ensuring the product reached those who could pay while maintaining strict order within their ranks. Anyone who tried to operate independently or undercut him disappeared quickly, leaving behind warnings for others who might consider stepping out of line. This combination of addiction and intimidation created a citywide dependency that Raven could exploit at will. Power was no longer just about fear, it had become deeply ingrained in the very fabric of Liverpool's daily life. As Raven's empire expanded, the city's response became increasingly fragmented. Community leaders tried to organize prevention programs and accidental campaigns, but resources were scarce, and the drug spread was relentless. Even parents who tried to shelter their children found themselves powerless against the temptation or coercion that came from the streets. The more the city struggled, the stronger Raven's grip became, as his ability to manipulate both crime and despair made him untouchable. He watched from the shadows, his empire growing with each overdose, each robbery, and each silent moment of fear that passed through the streets. By the time the initial shock of the drug's arrival faded, Liverpool had changed forever. Families were fractured, communities weakened, and the city's authorities were left scrambling to respond. The streets were no longer just streets. They were arteries pumping Raven's influence into every corner of life. The people who survived the early waves of addiction and violence carried with them a sense of unease, a silent understanding that the city they had once known had been reshaped under the shadow of a single man. Liverpool had become a city addicted not only to drugs, but to fear, and Raven was at the center of it all, unseen yet omnipresent, watching his empire grow stronger with every passing night. Raven's empire was far more than just drugs and fear. It was a carefully constructed network that extended into every corner of Liverpool, yet remained almost invisible to those outside it. On the surface, the city appeared normal. Shops, warehouses, and cafes operated as usual, but behind closed doors a sophisticated system of control ensured Raven's dominance. Front businesses funneled money, couriers transported parcels hidden among legitimate goods, and even some city officials were quietly complicit, either out of fear or personal gain. This invisible infrastructure allowed the gang to operate on a scale that few could comprehend, and law enforcement found themselves chasing shadows rather than criminals. The strength of Raven's network lay in its secrecy. Each member knew only what they needed to know. Street-level dealers handled customers, but had no access to the larger operations. Couriers transported goods without ever knowing their origin or destination. Managers of front businesses kept meticulous records that seemed normal on the surface, but concealed encrypted information, contracts, and instructions for the gang's inner circle. This compartmentalization made the organization nearly impossible to dismantle from the outside. Every attempt by police to follow a lead ended in frustration, as one clue often led to a dozen dead ends. Communication was another key to Raven's control. Messages were encoded, meetings held in obscure locations, and couriers used silent signals to convey information. Even trusted associates were subject to tests of loyalty, ensuring that betrayal was minimized. Raven himself rarely appeared in person at transactions, preferring to orchestrate events from a distance. His absence created a sense of mystery that enhanced both fear and respect among his followers. No one knew his exact location, yet his presence was felt everywhere, like a shadow moving through the streets. The gang also relied heavily on intimidation and selective violence to maintain control. Those who spoke out, attempted to leave or challenge the organization faced swift consequences. Abandoned buildings, quiet docks, and empty streets often bore the evidence of these warnings. Burned-out cars, spray-painted messages, or bodies left as symbols of power. The lessons were clear. Loyalty was non-negotiable, secrecy was mandatory, and crossing Raven's path could be fatal. Fear was as much a tool as money, giving him control that extended beyond the reach of any weapon. Despite the pervasive influence, law enforcement continued their pursuit. Detectives pored over surveillance footage, followed informants, and attempted to track financial transactions that seemed ordinary on the surface. Slowly, patterns emerged, revealing glimpses of the network structure. Yet every time investigators believed they had a breakthrough, Raven's foresight ensured that the trail went cold. Even those who tried to cooperate with authorities often disappeared mysteriously before providing substantial information. It became clear that taking down Raven was not a simple matter of arrests or raids. It required understanding a complex, hidden ecosystem of loyalty, fear, and secrecy that spanned the entire city. By the time the scope of Raven's organization became apparent, Liverpool had already been transformed. Neighborhoods were under the subtle control of his network. Businesses served as both fronts and surveillance points, and fear permeated everyday life. The city had become a living web of unseen forces, with Raven at its center, invisible yet omnipotent. The people who lived there sensed the presence of a power that was everywhere and nowhere, shaping their lives without revealing its full form. Liverpool had become a city controlled not just by crime, but by a hidden system so intricate and efficient that it seemed almost untouchable, leaving the authorities with a growing sense of frustration and the realization that the true battle had only just begun. Just as Raven's control over Liverpool seemed unshakable, a new threat emerged from the shadows. A rival gang, younger and more reckless, began moving into the territories he had carefully secured. Unlike Raven, who relied on strategy and patience, this new faction acted with impulsive aggression, leaving a trail of chaos in their wake. At first, the confrontations were minor: graffiti on walls, stolen shipments, and skirmishes in back alleys, but the tension escalated quickly. The city began to feel the pressure of a brewing storm, as fear and uncertainty rippled through neighborhoods that had once been tightly controlled by Raven's system. The rival gang's boldness forced Raven to respond, but not in the way outsiders expected. Rather than striking immediately, he observed, learned, and calculated. He studied the newcomers' patterns, their weaknesses, and their alliances, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Unlike them, Raven understood that brute force alone could not maintain long-term control. His strikes were precise, surgical, and devastating, sending clear warnings without revealing his full strength. The streets of Liverpool became a silent battlefield, where invisible lines marked territories and every movement carried risk. Escalation was inevitable. The two factions clashed in abandoned warehouses, darkened streets, and quiet docks. Explosions, fires, and sudden disappearances sent the city into shock. Residents learned quickly that stepping outside after dark could be dangerous, that a wrong turn could mean encountering violence at its rawest. Witnesses remained silent, fearing retaliation, while the police struggled to contain the surge in crime. The city had become a pressure cooker, and the tension was palpable. Every alley, every dimly lit street, held the potential for conflict. Yet even amid the chaos, Raven's true strength lay not in the violence itself, but in the alliances he quietly forged. Former rivals, corrupt officials, and opportunistic criminals all fell in line when they recognized the calculated power behind his operation. While the younger gang relied on reckless attacks and visible aggression, Raven manipulated the rules of the streets with a sophistication that left them exposed. Their mistakes became his advantage, and slowly he began to corner them, forcing them into positions where their own recklessness would betray them. The violence, however, was not without cost. Innocent bystanders were caught in the crossfire, and neighborhoods suffered damage that would take months, even years, to repair. Fires destroyed homes, businesses were ransacked, and the sense of safety that Liverpool residents once felt evaporated. The city's underbelly had always been dangerous, but the struggle between Raven and the new gang amplified every threat, leaving a stark reminder that power came at a price. By the end of the chapter, it became clear that Raven's empire was not invincible. Challenges, even if carefully managed, could escalate into chaos, and the streets of Liverpool had become a volatile arena where control was never guaranteed. Yet his ability to anticipate threats, exploit weaknesses, and manipulate fear ensured that he remained a step ahead. The city watched silently, caught between awe and terror, as the balance of power shifted in ways that no one could fully predict. The darkness in Liverpool was no longer just a backdrop. It had become a living, breathing force, shaping the lives of everyone in its path. Even the most meticulously built empire is vulnerable from within, and Raven's was no exception. For years he had maintained control through a combination of fear, loyalty, and secrecy. But cracks began to appear as ambition festered among those closest to him. One lieutenant, long considered unshakable in loyalty, quietly began feeding information to the authorities. His motives were layered, part resentment, part desire for power, and part survival instinct. But the consequences would be catastrophic. Every movement, every shipment, every hidden safehouse risked exposure, and the empire that had seemed untouchable suddenly had a new invisible enemy: betrayal. Law enforcement, now armed with insider knowledge, began to piece together the intricate web of Raven's operations. What had once been a series of disconnected incidents now revealed patterns that hinted at the true scale of the empire. Investigators tracked shipments, monitored communications, and quietly observed associates who had once seemed untouchable. For the first time, the police could glimpse the structure behind the fear, but the risk was immense. Raven's organization was built on silence and retaliation, and a single misstep could cost lives. Every officer involved moved cautiously, aware that one wrong decision could end the operation before it began. Within the gang, paranoia began to grow. Raven's lieutenants noticed subtle changes in behavior, missed meetings, unusual inquiries, and an underlying tension that had previously been absent. The shadow of suspicion loomed over even the most trusted members. No one knew who might be feeding information to the authorities, and loyalty became both a shield and a trap. Every glance, every gesture, every whispered conversation could carry meaning, and the internal pressure threatened to destabilize the empire more effectively than any outside attack. Raven himself, though aware of the betrayal, approached the situation with his usual calculated patience. He did not act impulsively. Instead, he began testing the loyalty of his inner circle through carefully orchestrated maneuvers. Small operations were allowed to fail, traps were set, and weaknesses were exposed without revealing the full extent of his power. The lieutenant who had betrayed him found himself navigating a dangerous game he could not fully control. Raven's response was subtle, yet lethal. Psychological manipulation, combined with hidden contingencies that ensured the traitor's position remained precarious, leaving him trapped in a web of his own making. Outside the organization, the city continued to feel the pressure of these hidden battles. Drug shipments were disrupted, violence escalated in isolated pockets, and residents sensed a change in the undercurrent of the streets. The invisible war between law enforcement and Raven's empire was beginning to spill into public spaces, though few could recognize its origin. To the ordinary citizen, the city seemed chaotic without explanation, but beneath the surface, a precise and deadly struggle for control was unfolding. By the end of this chapter, it was clear that Raven's empire, while still powerful, was no longer unassailable. Betrayal from within and the relentless pursuit by authorities had introduced uncertainty into what had once been an orderly system of fear and loyalty. Yet Raven's intelligence, foresight, and strategic patience ensured that he remained a step ahead, had both his enemies and his betrayers. Liverpool's darkest streets had never been so tense, with invisible forces maneuvering in ways that would decide the fate of an empire built on shadows. The balance of power teetered on the edge, and the city waited, unaware of how close it was to witnessing a collapse that could change everything. After months of meticulous planning, law enforcement finally moved to dismantle Raven's empire. The operation was unprecedented in scale, involving multiple units working together to strike simultaneously across Liverpool. Police officers, plainclothes agents, and specialized teams prepared for a confrontation that had been building for years. Armed with intelligence from inside Raven's organization, every warehouse, shipping yard, and front business was mapped, every courier tracked, and every financial transaction analyzed. The city held its breath, unaware that a storm was about to break over its darkest street. The raids began in the dead of night, under the cover of darkness. Officers moved silently, storming warehouses where crates of illegal goods were hidden beneath legitimate cargo. Couriers were intercepted before they could alert others, and phones and encrypted devices were seized for forensic analysis. Explosions of sirens and shouting filled the air as gang members, unprepared for the scale of the operation, scrambled to escape. Streets that had long been silent with fear now buzzed with confusion and panic. It was a display of force unlike anything the city had seen, and for many it was the first visible sign that Raven's control could be challenged. Inside the operation, tension was high. Officers knew that one wrong move could cost lives. Traps had been anticipated, as Raven's reputation for cunning suggested that resistance would be strategic, not chaotic. Yet despite careful planning, some surprises emerged. Hidden rooms, secret exits, and decoy shipments forced law enforcement to adapt on the spot. Every moment was a gamble, and the operation tested both nerves and skills to their limits. The stakes were immense, not just for the authorities, but for the citizens whose streets had long been ruled by fear. As the raids continued, the scale of Raven's empire became startlingly clear. Millions in cash, drugs, and weapons were seized, revealing the vast network that had operated invisibly across Liverpool. Front businesses, previously considered legitimate, were exposed as integral parts of a sophisticated system of control. The city saw, perhaps for the first time, the extent of the hidden operations that had caused so much suffering and fear. Headlines would later describe it as one of the largest crackdowns in recent memory, a testament to the reach of an empire that had once seemed untouchable. Yet even in defeat, Raven's presence remained elusive. The man himself was nowhere to be found. Investigators discovered traces of his movements, encrypted messages deleted at the last moment, accounts emptied just before seizure, and escape routes carefully planned, but he had vanished. To the public, it seemed almost mythical, a criminal so powerful that even when the law struck directly at him, he could disappear without a trace. His absence only heightened his legend, leaving questions about his true wealth, remaining influence, and potential for return. By dawn, Liverpool's streets were quieter, but the impact of the raids lingered. Communities began the slow process of recovery. Hospitals and social services worked to address the aftermath, and families affected by the drug trade felt a fragile sense of relief. The city had witnessed the fall of an empire, yet the story was far from over. Raven's ghostly presence remained in the shadows, a reminder that even when exposed, the power he wielded over Liverpool's darkest streets could not be fully erased. The city had survived the storm, but the memory of his influence lingered, leaving everyone to wonder if the darkness was truly gone or merely waiting for another opportunity to rise. With Raven gone, at least from the streets, Liverpool seemed to breathe a little easier. The warehouses were empty, the drug shipments seized, and the most visible members of his gang behind bars. For many residents, there was a fragile sense of relief, a feeling that perhaps the city's darkest streets were finally free from the grip of fear. But the reality was far more complicated. The scars left by years of violence, addiction, and intimidation could not be erased overnight. Communities that had once thrived were fractured, families struggled to rebuild, and the city itself bore silent testimony to the power that had once ruled invisibly among them. The absence of Raven did not mean peace. The void he left created uncertainty, and uncertainty always attracts new predators. Rival factions, emboldened by his disappearance, began to test the boundaries of control. Smaller gangs tried to expand into his former territories, while opportunistic criminals exploited gaps in the law enforcement presence. The streets, once carefully managed under a strict hierarchy of fear and loyalty, became unpredictable. For residents, life remained tense, as the city adjusted to a new, unstable order where threats could appear at any moment. Recovery was slow. Programs were established to help those addicted to drugs, but the reach of Raven's empire had been extensive, and many who had fallen into dependency faced long and difficult paths to recovery. Social services worked tirelessly, yet the scale of the problem often felt overwhelming. Schools, community centers, and local charities became critical spaces for those trying to reclaim stability. But the memory of years under Raven's shadow lingered in the streets, a quiet reminder of how deeply the city had been affected. Even law enforcement, triumphant in their raids, recognized that their victory was incomplete. While the most visible elements of Raven's organization had been dismantled, some parts of his network remained hidden. Cash and resources had vanished, and some loyal associates had escaped capture. The ghost of Raven's influence persisted, shaping the behavior of those who remained in the underworld. Investigators understood that while the city had won a major battle, the war against crime and corruption was ongoing. The challenge was no longer just stopping one man, it was addressing a system that had allowed him to rise in the first place. For the people of Liverpool, life returned to a semblance of normalcy, yet the tension never fully disappeared. Parents remained vigilant, neighborhoods watched over each other cautiously, and whispers about the empire that had once dominated the city circulated in quiet corners. Children who had grown up under the shadow of Raven's control remembered the fear and the restrictions on their streets, shaping a new generation, wary of the dangers hidden in plain sight. By the end, the story of Liverpool's darkest streets became a cautionary tale, a reminder of how power, fear, and secrecy can shape a city, and how resilience, vigilance, and courage are required to reclaim it. The darkness had receded, but it had not vanished. Raven was gone, but his legacy remained etched into the alleys, docks, and hidden corners of Liverpool. The city had survived, but it had been forever changed. And somewhere, in the shadows of the streets, the faint possibility lingered that darkness, patient and watchful, might one day return.